Thank you, ladies and gentlemen, for giving me the opportunity to be here. Thank you, Sheriff Mack, Tanya, Mrs. Mack, everybody that's worked very hard, Sam, to make this happen. It's always a great honor for me to be here. I wanted to mention to you, I have a legal foundation. It is brand new. It is called Liberty First Legal. Our website is libertyfirst.legal. And just to let you know how we operate, my husband calls us the Good Guy ACLU. We are a nonprofit legal organization. We are a brand new startup. We are building our networks across the country. And even so, we've already had 2 huge victories in the states of Massachusetts and Vermont. I want to explain to you that we have a little bit of a unique way of dealing with issues. That's something you might want to think about first. Although I am an attorney, I am probably the least litigious attorney that exists on this planet. I believe that there is a requirement for us to do and exhaust everything possible before we get legal lawyers involved. And I know from experience that the moment you say, talk to my lawyer, people lawyer up and gears shut down, nobody talks, and things just come to a screeching halt. So what I do at Liberty First Legal is I stay in the background, which is counterintuitive for a nonprofit organization. What they do is they want to be out there in the forefront right away so they can start bragging on what they're doing so they can get donors to help. My goal is not donors. Number one, I know my provision comes from God. He has called me to this, and for 11 years, 260 meetings a year in over 22 states, we have never charged a speaking fee. And God has never let us miss a mortgage or let us starve or anything. And I'm raising a 14-year-old boy. You know how much that food costs. So what I do is I work on the background. I give you the language to send the letters to these people, and then you sign your name to it, not me. Because then the dialogue can keep going and all the lawyers don't get involved. And you can keep relationships with people that you need to keep. In Massachusetts, we had a church who was threatening to be shut down by the state health department. A church that had a relationship with the city they're in for 40 years. If we had lawyered up right away, not only would we may not have had the success that we had, but the relationship with the city would have been destroyed. So I stayed in the background. I gave the church leadership what they needed to do. We worked on creating solutions. We worked on creating correspondences. We were able, in the very end, the long story to be short, we were able to not only stop the county and the city from harassing, and the county, the city, and the state, the governor was actually using this little church of 50 people in his speeches to talk about COVID outbreaks. We were not only able to stop that, but we got an email of apology from the state health department, and none of them knew I was involved. See, that's how we need to work, because remember when I stood up here yesterday, relationships are the key. Most sheriffs don't want to stand up because they don't want to burn bridges. I want to help you keep those relationships as long as possible. In Vermont, we did the same thing. And it wasn't until the very end that I actually had to come forward and speak to the health department, the doctor who's the director of the health department, and we managed to make it all the way through to the end. And after I spoke to the doctor who's the director of the health department, they backed off. But we maintained relationships, and that's important. I'm not looking for a spotlight here, guys. I am looking for my son to be free. This is the whole reason why I'm here. This is why my husband and I have dedicated 11 years of our lives. Because we have a boy we want to be free, and you guys have to be that for us. See, what you do impacts the world. It's not just your county, it's the world we're changing. When you study the Constitution with me, when I come and teach, I teach you a history of people where one man named James Otis Jr. stood up publicly alone in February of 1761 and changed the entire world. That sounds like, geez, Chris, I don't want that kind of responsibility. I don't want that kind of pressure. How many of you figured out I'm a kind of a plain-spoken person? I'm just going to put it out there, whether you like it or not. It's going to happen. If that's not who you want to be, you're in the wrong job. By being sheriff, you did not become a law enforcement officer. I wish that we could wipe that from our vocabulary. Your job is not law enforcement. Your job is people protection. Your job is rights protection. Your job is defense of the Constitution, not law enforcement. Yes, in the carrying out of those activities, enforcing the law is something that you will be doing. But there will also be times when you will be refusing to enforce the law so that you will protect people's rights, so that you will defend your Constitution. And that is your job first and foremost. And I need you. Our children need you. And I know you want to do the right thing, otherwise you wouldn't be here. You want to have that knowledge and that virtue to do that. But the bottom line is this: you're not going to be in that uniform forever. You're not going to be sheriff forever. And the things you do today will be carried on in the future. Which means when you justify a violation of someone's rights for a means to an end, when you justify violating a constitution or a property right of the people as a means to the end, you give permission to those violations to be inflicted on your family sometime in the future, because one day you will not wear that uniform. These are the things that should be running through your head. The power I am exercising right now, the law that I am enforcing right now. Do I want that same power? Do I want that same law to be used by the most evil sheriff I can think of in my mind? That's something that should go through your head every single day. What I'm doing right now, do I want the most evil sheriff I can imagine to have this authority? Because that's a possibility. When I teach lawmakers, I tell them, before you say yay or nay to a law, you must come up and say to yourself, this law I'm about to pass, do I want the most evil person in the world I know to have that power? Because if the answer is no, then you have to not vote in favor of that law. I understand very well where I'm standing and who I'm talking to, and what the majority of your ideologies are. So I do not say what I'm about to say lightly, but I do say it with confidence in knowledge and love in my heart. Joe Biden could not be doing what he's doing if conservative hadn't give Donald Trump permission to do the things he had done contrary to the Constitution. And that is a fact. Because the standard is the Constitution, not personalities, not parties, but principles. And these are the things that we need to keep in mind. I don't know how many of you have seen the letter that was published by Sheriff Mike Harrington of Chavez County, New Mexico, to his governor, okay? Now, I'm not going to read the whole thing, but I want you to see what it says. As a constitutional officer, it's my duty and obligation to defend the rights of the people against every and all infringements. It's my duty and obligation to defend the Constitution of the state of New Mexico against all violations and abuses of power. The last paragraph. The question here today is whether we overturn 244 years of history and duty of the sheriff for a new and radical ideology that replaces the duty of the sheriff to protect the rights of the people and the Constitution of New Mexico with an unconstitutional and unchecked power exercised by a governor that looks more like a monarch than a servant of the people. You see, we need to understand something very, very important. The duty of the sheriff to defend the Constitution applies to both the federal and state constitutions. That's what your oath says. Here in Texas, it is an oath. In every state in the United States, it's an oath to protect the U.S. Constitution and the Constitution of the United States. You need to know your state constitution. You also need to know and understand that your state legislature, your county commission, your governor can act unconstitutionally, and it's your duty to refuse to enforce those. Can I tell you, I teach a constitutional class for deputies and sheriffs, in which in a section, I have a whole section, how do I keep you from being sued? I taught in the law enforcement academies. I know what you're taught constitutionally, and it's garbage. Do you know our taxpayers spend over $1 billion every year paying people who've had their civil rights violated by local law enforcement, just local law enforcement, deputies and police. Over $1 billion of the year, and that comes out of your budget, by the way. You want to know how you keep from being sued? You know your state constitution. You know and respect people's civil rights. Then even if the county orders you to do it, you say no. Because if you follow the county's orders, the county will be sued, and so will you. But if you say no, I will not enforce this, the county will be sued and you will not. You have a separation of powers. This is the Texas Constitution, but wherever you may be, there's a separation of powers clause in your state constitution that denies the governor the authority to write law. Your governors do not have a constitutional authority at the state level to issue executive orders and expect them to be upheld as law. These COVID restrictions coming from your governors not only violate U.S. Constitution, but more relevantly and more importantly, violate your state constitution. And they violate it in the most violent way, according to our founders, a violation of separation of powers. You see, we separated powers in America in our constitutional republic. Why? Because when you have an executive who can write law, the definition of that body is a king. In America, we said not only we are not bound by Great Britain anymore on July 2nd, 1776, we declared that America will have no more kings. But we have sat by as we have transformed the offices of our executive. And I'll point out to you that the CSPOA, what is that called? The agreement charter thing? Resolution, thank you for that word. Says executives. It doesn't say president. It says executives. And your governor is an executive, that you have the authority and the duty to refuse to enforce their pretended laws. Your state constitution has a Bill of Rights. Every state constitution has a Bill of Rights. And within that Bill of Rights, everything within the state constitution mirrors that of the U.S. Bill of Rights, and I'll agree with whoever said it earlier today, I don't remember. Our state bills of rights are better than the federal Bill of Rights because they're more specific and they're organized better, for the most part. Some of them not so much, but for the most part. You have a Republican form of government. You have religious freedom. You have freedom of speech and freedom of press. You have the right to peaceably assemble and to petition the government for a redress of grievances. Our founders knew that these were essential principles that without the preservation, by the way, preservation and application, if you preserve something and never yourself exercise it, it's as if it doesn't exist at all. It's like being on the side of the road with a flat tire and sitting there for hours wondering what you're going to do, knowing you have a spare tire in the trunk, but you don't even bother to open it up and use it. That whole time you're sitting on the side of the road wondering how you're going to fix your flat tire with a spare sitting in the trunk, it's as if you have no spare at all. You have to use them or you lose them. And be careful how the media and the public tries to sow seeds of chaos and confusion. They do that on purpose, by the way, because the media feeds off chaos. They profit off chaos. But what we need to understand is there are two institutions that profit off chaos: media and politicians. So let's just be clear. This is not freedom of speech. Waving a machete and demanding someone get out of their car. This is not a protest. 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 And we need to understand that the difference is very simple. There is no such thing as a violent protest, because the second someone becomes violent, they are no longer protesting, they are a criminal. There is no duty to protect this in spite of what Fox lawyer news correspondent Greta Van Susteren said. You have no duty to ensure that someone who is beating up people and damaging property has the right to do that. That badge gives you a duty to arrest those people immediately without question, regardless of what group they belong to and the color of their skin. But the constitutions and your oath require that you protect and defend all peaceful protesters, regardless of whether you agree with what they're saying or not. By the way, the politicians profit off of this. That's why they're busy conflating the terms. You know why? Because when you see the city burning like this, you don't hear people getting together. We need to form a community coalition. We need to get with our churches so that we can pull together the charitable funding to help these people. We can start as our church and community educating people on how to peacefully control their governments. No. When people see this, they don't think, what can I do? They think, government, come do this. And when you do that, you empower government to do things they're not entitled and delegated to do. This is the test, guys, and this is Benjamin Franklin in 1722. That men ought to speak well of their governors is true, while their governors deserve to be well spoken of. But to do public mischief without hearing of it is only the prerogative and felicity of tyranny. A free people will be showing that they are so by their freeness of speech. Your state constitutions, the right to keep and bear arms. Look at this Texas Constitution. Every citizen shall have the right to keep and bear arms in the lawful defense of himself or his state. But the legislature shall have the power by law to regulate the wearing of arms. Not the purchasing, not the selling, not the use, other than you cannot harm someone with it. The wearing. That is the only authorization in the Texas Constitution for a state regulation on the right to keep and bear arms. That's it. No more. Combine that with Section 9, that the people shall be secure in their persons, houses, papers, and effects against unreasonable searches and seizures. You don't need a lawyer, by the way, to define for you what a reasonable search and seizure is. Your Constitution already does. You have to have a warrant based upon probable cause, supported by oath or affirmation, particularly describing the place to be searched and the persons or things to be seized. You must have all 5 elements present at the exact same time in order to be a viable and a constitutional search. Don't come to me and talk to me about exigent circumstance. That is not an exception in there. Don't talk to me about officer safety. That is not an exception in there. You must develop procedure and practice to keep your officers safe. You do not develop a procedure and practice of violating people's rights to do it. Exigent circumstance. I was a prosecutor for a decade. I know how it works. We're there to effectuate, we're there and to talk to these people. And all of a sudden, they start running and flushing, and we hear the toilet flushing. Oh, no, we got to run in and get them. Not without a warrant, you don't. Because here's the philosophy. You sometimes have to let a bad guy go to ensure that no good guys are accidentally having their rights violated. And that's the standard of American due process. But you guys know criminal behavior. This is what I told my prosecutors all the time. You are prosecutors, not persecutors, and you need to know the difference. Criminal behavior is very predictable. So this guy got off on a technicality. You didn't actually get to seize those drugs. But guess what? Criminal behavior dictates you're going to have another chance. Why violate somebody's rights when you know that person is going to give you another chance? And here's the good news. If they don't, then maybe the system actually worked and they learned their lesson, or maybe they were actually a good guy and you had bad information. Right to keep and bear arms, right to be free from unreasonable searches and seizures. Look at this. Every state constitution has this. No citizen of the state shall be deprived of life, liberty, property, privileges, or immunities in any manner disenfranchised except by the due course of law. This is why you cannot enforce these temporary restraining orders, the red flag laws. These red flag laws under your health code in Texas, some by law, establish a system where Americans are now guilty until they prove themselves innocent. You are taking property without due process. And there are ways to ensure that people are safe. There are ways to ensure that people with mental illness are dealt with that do not have to involve depriving people of their life and their liberty and their property without due process. And that applies to government regulation too, by the way. Let me explain something to you. I talked about it a little bit yesterday, and I'm almost done. This is John Trenchard. You guys know the Declaration of Independence by now, right? We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal and endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Jefferson didn't make up that term, pursuit of happiness. He learned it from his mentor, John Trenchard. John Trenchard wrote, with another man, started writing the Cato letters in 1721. And this is actually Cato letter number 68, where it explains what pursuit of happiness means. And he doesn't say it's social justice or free stuff. He says this very simply. Let me break it down to you. Happiness is the product of independence, because you cannot be happy unless you are independent. What is the opposite of being independent? Slavery, dependency. Dependency and slavery are the same thing. You cannot have happiness if you are a slave or dependent. You may have moments of being happy in that, but you will not have the state of happiness. Happiness is the product of independence, but you cannot have independence without property ownership. Independence is the product of property ownership. Now, property ownership, as our founders defined it, is complete dominion and control over what is your own. You don't have complete dominion and control if you have to get a license or a permission slip from the government to run your business. The minute you have to get a license from government to run your business, you don't own your business, they own it. You're an indentured servant. And we ought to know that by now, as we watched health departments shut down our restaurants unequally, with bias and prejudice. Costco and Walmart can stay open, but mom and pop have to close. You see, how many of our businesses that were shut down by governors and mayors and counties had due process of law before their restaurants and their businesses were shut down? Your state constitution requires due process of law before the taking of any property. Not only that, your state constitutions also require that those businesses, before they are shut down, receive just compensation for the loss of their businesses. How many of our business owners got checks for the loss of their businesses? And by the way, it is a taking of their property, regardless of whether there is an emergency excuse involved or if it's only temporary. Because for many of your businesses, it's not temporary. Every day is permanent. And you cannot have happiness without independence. You cannot have independence without property ownership, and you cannot have property ownership in society unless you have a government that is built on the foundation of liberty. See, this is why we have sheriffs all over America already doing what we're trying to teach that you have the authority to do. We're not asking you to do anything that hasn't been done. We're not asking you to do anything we haven't done ourselves. Nobody's asked me, Krisanne, why were you a prosecutor for 10 years and then stopped? Because I was fired. I was fired as an assistant state attorney in the state of Florida because I was teaching the Constitution to groups on my own time and on my own dime. My boss told me that to teach that the Constitution demands limited government is an ethical conflict of interest for anyone who works for the government. And then he made the demand that I had to cease and desist teaching the Constitution as I was, and I must cease and desist all my association in my own private time. This is a lawyer, by the way, saying this to me. With right-wing fringe groups. You know, the middle schoolers I was teaching on the First Amendment. The school board I was helping get through invocation without the ACLU and the what is that other place? The Against Freedom of Religion people. He gave me an ultimatum. Stop this or quit. Now, my husband and I had just planted a church, and the only income in the house was mine. I can tell you, I could have made the choice to go back to work with my mouth shut. But my spirit would not let me do that because I was created in the image of God, and God created me to be free, and I will show my freedom to the glory of God by the freeness of my speech. And my husband said, we can't actually live by faith if we don't live by faith. So we said, I'm not going to stop teaching. I'm not going to stop speaking. And my boss said, then you have to quit. I said, no, sir, I'm not quitting either. So he fired me. But you see where I am now. Because what man meant for evil, God meant for good. And that's, by the way, why we don't have speaking fees. Because God started us in his mission, and I'm not going to steal what belongs to God. He will bring hearts and minds in line to fund us. He will bring hearts and minds in line to receive what we have to teach, not me. In 11 years, I have never changed anyone's mind. But what I teach has had an impact on people that has caused them to change their own minds. And that's the same platform you have, your activity. Let me show you one of my favorite sections of the Texas Constitution. I think every state constitution should amend their constitution to invoke this. This is Article 1, Section 29. Bill of Rights accepted from powers of government and inviolate. To guard against transgressions of high powers herein delegated, we declare that everything in this Bill of Rights is accepted out of general powers of government and shall forever remain inviolate, and all laws contrary thereto or to the following provisions shall be void. Your Constitution supports you refusing to enforce laws and rules and regulations that go contrary to your Constitution. How many of your regulatory agencies, licensing for alcohol, licensing for this, that, and the other, take these people's property without due process? You have an obligation to step up and say to the health department, you're not shutting down this business until we give them a trial. And I'm not talking about an administrative hearing. I don't know if you understand how wicked those administrative hearings are. An administrative hearing is a hearing in the very agency that's bringing the action with a judge who's paid by the agency. How is that a fair trial? And the Constitution does not come into play, by the way. That particular administrative law judge will determine whether that agency is following their rules properly. They don't care if their rules follow the Constitution. That's why you have to say no. You have James Wilson echoing your Texas Constitution, saying that anything contrary to the Constitution will not have the force of law. Can I ask you a sort of academic question? What obligation do you as a sheriff have to enforce something that does not have the force of law? I mean, that's how simple this is, really. I'm not telling you it's easy, mind you. I'm telling you it's very simple. You don't have to have a PhD to understand that if it's not in the Constitution, it is not authorized, therefore it does not have the force of law. And you must encourage your citizens to refuse to comply. Because undelegated power is null and void. We call it peaceful noncompliance. And peaceful noncompliance is not the people violating the law. Peaceful noncompliance is you enforcing the supreme law of the land when the agents of government are violating that law because you took an oath to support and defend. That's why I brag on Brad Rogers everywhere I go. I was just noticing you look a little bit different these days. You look much healthier. Maybe it's because you're a county commissioner now. Look at this. This is the letter that Brad Rogers sent to the U.S. As a press release when people were bragging on him for standing up against the USDA and the FDA. Your local government, your local officials can stem the tide of federal overreach if they just apply a little backbone. If that's not a charge, I don't know what is. Expect it and demand it. Whether you're a conservative or a liberal, I will be a guardian of the what? Constitution for you, and will not stand idly by while the rights of my country are trampled, whether by criminals or an overreaching government. You got Sheriff Marty Gleave of Piute County, Utah, refusing the Federal Forestry Service to dictate practice on them. And under this administration, there are more things coming. You need to be aware of the current affairs in our country. By the way, I think every sheriff should have a person who works in their office directly responsible only to the sheriff to make sure that you are up to date on laws that are being presented to your state legislature and laws that are being presented in the U.S. Congress. Because here's one of them. H.R. 350. This is a U.S. law that is being presented to the House of Representatives. It is titled Domestic Terrorism, but the entire bill is geared to identify conservatives and religious people as white supremacists. Because you don't have to be white to be a white supremacist. You just have to have the wrong ideology. And you have to be able to refuse FBI, DOJ, access to your county to have anything to do with the enforcement of this as if it passes. So you better know what it says. This week, the House Committee on Energy and Commerce held a hearing called Fanning the Flames, Disinformation and Extremism in Media. If you watch my podcast, which is something that person who works for you on current events should be doing, we explained to you that this entire hearing is about silencing speech not endorsed by government. You have to be prepared to step up against this. I'm going to steal this from Sheriff Mack, but can you imagine how different America would be today if we had had a sheriff in the civil rights movement who understood that what they were doing was standing against unconstitutional and violative laws of the people? Because I was just enforcing the law is what they tried to say in Nuremberg. Why would we even try to have that come out of our mouths as Americans? Come on now, you've heard people say that in your profession. You need to know that the Supremacy Clause does not bind you. By the way, I got the right one up there, Sheriff. Goldstein did email Rogers and warned him that interfering with a federal investigation could be prosecuted as a felony and would carry up to 3-year term in prison. Goldstein also cited the Federal Supremacy Clause that the Supreme Court has interpreted as making federal rules and laws superior to local ones. Goldstein wrote, "The Supremacy Clause has been interpreted since the earliest days of the nation to mean that federal law trumps state law whenever the two conflict. Let me remind you that you have authority superior to the U.S. Supreme Court." I know that sounds scary, but it's absolutely a fact, and you need to receive that fact because let me just give you a little Supreme Court history lesson. It is the Supreme Court of the United States that declared black men property, not the Constitution. It is the Supreme Court of the United States that said our health departments could force sterilize people to the tune of nearly 90,000 people in America for being undesirable. It is the Supreme Court of the United States that said that the President of the United States could legally and forcefully incarcerate American citizens without due process, men, women, children, in internment camps during World War II. Some of those people were born and died in those internment camps. They lasted over 4 years. So if you don't understand the duty, you don't have somebody in your office that can help you with this, then you need to call me or Mr. Perutka so we can work this out for you. Because these people need you to stand for them. Shelley Luther should have never been arrested. The sheriff should have been there and told the state police to go take a hike. These New Jersey gym owners should have never had to have been arrested 3 times. And my pastor was arrested by this sheriff who held, let me tell you the craziness about this. Sorry, can I have a few more minutes, Sheriff? Am I good? Let me tell you the craziness about this. My pastor was charged. I hope you see the insanity of this. My pastor was charged with 2 second-degree misdemeanors. Sheriff Chad Cronister not only issued a warrant for his arrest for 2 second-degree misdemeanors, which were health code violations, he sent helicopters to fly over his house to help effectuate the arrest. Then, while my pastor was, the very minute my pastor was being arrested, Cronister held a press conference to tell the people what a hero he was for arresting a pastor for 2 second-degree misdemeanors. Has anybody here in this room ever done a press conference for arresting somebody for a misdemeanor? Sent helicopters to arrest somebody for a misdemeanor. He said at the press conference, you guys will know this, this is off the chain, guys, totally off the chart. At this press conference, he sat there and told the entire world that he was afraid to arrest our pastor during church service because our church is known to have a cache of weapons, and he was afraid for his officers' safety. Let me tell you a little secret that Chad didn't tell everybody. In that service, were 4 off-duty deputies that he had assigned at that service to help us with security, as had been the case for the last 10 years.
I got one even better. I
This-
had CPS and the Attorney General's office point guns at me because I took a picture with the militia member.
Well, that's what's coming under HR 350, by the way. HR 350, or if you're in a photograph with someone that is identified as a MAGA hat or a MAGA shirt or whatever, you are now a white supremacist. By the way, just as a little bonus for your educational dollar, that guy standing behind the sheriff is a pastor who spoke at the press conference condemning my pastor for having church. We had over 80,000 death threats because of what this sheriff doxing our church. We had to shut down for 2 months to make security arrangements. We put up walls and barriers and security. We spend $60,000 a month on security now just to have church, because we had 80,000 death threats and people were driving by and shooting at our signs. So you got to find out which side you're on. Because according to the narrative, these people are the faces of evil. The people who stood up in peaceful non-compliance and said, we will not comply with laws. And by the way, the people who actually applaud a sheriff who enforces an unconstitutional law, who violates the rights of the people, are these guys. So which side are you on? The Constitution was adopted in a period of grave emergency, and they are not altered by a state of emergency. There is no greater emergency in America today than existed when we were ratifying the Constitution. So there is no excuse that is even possible to justify violating a person's rights. You see, I'm trying to go the wrong direction. This is a charge. This whole conference is a charge. Sam, I loved what Sam said. I thought it was brilliant. We just don't want you to take our stuff. Right? Just leave my stuff alone. That means you have to stop civil asset forfeitures. You have to stop them. They're one of the most wicked arms of government that there is. It is a violation of every aspect of Constitution and property rights, civil asset forfeiture. If you have the authority constitutionally to remove and keep someone's property, then do it the right way through a hearing first. You shouldn't be so desperate for money for your county that you're pirating on the highways. And that's exactly what it is. It's pirating. I'm just going to call it like it is. You have to maintain your independence, because that's the beauty of the office of the sheriff. You are not a hireling of the governor. You don't work for the mayor. You don't work for the county. You are not beholden to any single individual for a paycheck. You are an elected defender of the rights of the people. Which means you have to refuse the free stuff from the federal government. All of those free toys and trinkets and money come with something very, very dangerous. It's called a mutual jurisdiction agreement. You see, they know you don't have any loyalty to them. They know you don't have any obligation to them. They also know your power in that county is superior to them. Otherwise, they wouldn't be trying to trick you into signing a contract to hand over that power to them. There would be no reason for a mutual jurisdiction agreement if they already had jurisdiction in your county, which they do not legally have. So they buy it from you. They extort it from you with trinkets. If you need it, let the people who support you, that you work for, come up with the money to get it for you. Otherwise, maybe you don't need it. These mutual jurisdiction agreements are formed by an errant foundation, by the way, that somehow you elevate your status by being a federal jurisdiction. No, you don't. You decrease your status. You diminish your authority by handing over to them. If Sheriff Brad Rogers had had a mutual jurisdiction agreement, he couldn't have told the FDA and the USDA to keep out. Because they would have said, we don't have to come to you, you get your permission, because here, we signed this. If you're just now learning about this, and you have mutual jurisdiction agreements, go back on Monday and get rid of them. Send a letter to whomever you yoked up with and say this: we would be happy to cooperate with you in any endeavor that you have forthcoming. But we want to be clear that we are rescinding this mutual jurisdiction agreement. If you have a case that needs to be worked or a warrant that needs to be effectuated, you need our assistance with an investigation. We'd be more than happy to evaluate that situation and help you according to our needs. But from this day forward, there'll be no more mutual jurisdiction agreement because, you see, we are the authority of this county and we have a duty to the people to make sure that we are guarding their rights. It's just that simple. Here's the thing, and this is the last thing that I'll mention to you before we go. The stuff that they give you, even the money, costs you more in the long run. Everything that you have to do to comply, all the regulations you must submit to, on the bottom line, put you in the red. We saw this in Texas, Sheriff. When the school districts, the independent school districts, stopped taking the federal school lunch money because they didn't want President Obama's wife's menu on their list. See, it made them figure out that, guess what? When we take this federal money, we're $30,000 in the hole every year. But when we refuse the federal money, we actually are $10,000 to $12,000 ahead every year. Because every dollar costs you at least $3. At least. People you got to hire, compliance, regulations. Let's do this. Let's promise to think about this seriously. Let's promise that when you go home and you drive in your work or in your personal life past a business, don't see it as a business. Picture the families. Picture the people. Because that is your duty. The little ones that depend on the paychecks. The mom and pops that depend on those businesses. Not even just depending. I guarantee you have small businesses in your communities that have taken generations to build. So you have authority you have an obligation and an authority to defend them, not to destroy them. And what you do is you help them defend themselves. If the health department says, if you don't do this, we're going to shut you down, you stand physically at the business and say, no, you will not. We'll cut off the water. Fine, we'll bring in buckets of water so they can run their business. We'll turn off the electricity. Okay, that's fine. Turn it off. We have generators. This is the time where we have to do everything humanly possible to come together as the communities we were designed to be. That's the power of a constitutional republic. We are a government built of individuals in communities, and we need to start acting like it. We are a bigger picture here with future generations that are hanging by a thread, by our ignorance, our apathy, and our fear. But we have a great, great foundation that should strengthen and empower us, because they've already laid the path. We just have to choose to walk it. And in that simple choice, you must simply say, I will defend the people, the families of my community against all criminal activity, against all violations, whether they be by criminals or an overreaching government. That's your duty. So I want to thank you so much for being a part of this weekend. I want to thank you for promising me that you won't leave this here, that you'll go out and think about this stuff as you go through your day, that you start teaching your deputies at home what this is about. Sheriff Mack has teaching material. Mike Peruka has teaching material. I have teaching material. We have all ways to disciple you to move forward so that our children will be free. Thank you, Sheriff, for the honor of being here. Thank you. God bless you guys.